is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living out the Catholic faith, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now, your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. We're standing on what is the most popular holiday in the country, Thanksgiving. It's more traveled than Christmas, more attended than the 4th of July, and more peaceful than Memorial Day. Probably because it focuses on a meal and doesn't involve gift giving, which is what contributes to its popularity. Its central pillar is hospitality, which everyone wants to offer as well as receive. It's no secret. People love Thanksgiving. And this might be a good time to think about how we might be connected to the tradition of giving thanks. Just as the Pilgrims were able to look around and note all they had been given and then be grateful for it, so we might turn to this strange world of ours and strive to make sense of how things are for us. According to the story of Thanksgiving, after spending their first year in the New World, the Pilgrims were challenged by every part of their new environment in virtually every way. The people, the soil, the food, and the circumstances in their new life, they were all vastly different than they had expected. After surviving the first cold winter of the year before and making their way through the challenges of the summer, they finished their harvest and set their new bounty on their tables and paused to give thanks to God for the year that they had been given. We might do the same for the year we've been given. It's hard for us to appreciate how puzzling this new colony was to the residents who had begun their new lives here. They were not prepared for how brutal things were, how brutal the winter was, for example. All of the northern hemisphere was undergoing what some now call the Little Ice Age. The temperatures then were much cooler than they are now. We're the beneficiaries of a couple of hundred years of global warming since then. These, our national ancestors, had to endure long, bitter winters, some of the coldest temperatures since the melting of the ice cap 10,000 years before then. When the snow began to fall on the forests outside of Boston and Plymouth, they had to huddle together collectively to stay warm. And like so many who watched the winter skies darken and the snow pile up month after month, they wondered if it would ever end. When the temperatures finally climbed and the snow melted, they were more than relieved, they were grateful. And the grain that they'd brought with them, which also wasn't much suitable to the place where they landed, clearing the forest for decent fields was almost impossible work. The wheat and oats they brought with them were scarce in their yield on the thin topsoil of the New England countryside. The only way to survive was to turn to the native crops of corn and squash and beans, as well as the fruit and tubers they had to learn about and could pick in the wild, and the game they harvested from the forests and their shores. Without their willingness to sit down at their tables with an entirely new cuisine, they wouldn't have been able to make the year. The Thanksgiving dinner they feasted on became a celebration of their adaptability, not just their hardiness. And when we sit down to eat turkey and sweet potatoes and pumpkin pie, we're eating which would have been for them a new taste and texture for each one of the Pilgrims. You try making a feast out of a table of food you've never much eaten before. That's what they did. And by doing so, they survived and even learned to thrive. And for this, they gave thanks. Besides the content of their day-to-day meals, they also had to make do with a challenge they had not considered when they arrived. They had to learn how to work. We think of this work as the premier colonial virtue, but it wasn't for them. They were prisoners of their culture and their expectation. In the world from which they came, manual labor was left to the poorest and the most despised. Their household depended on the labor of the serving classes in order to prosper. Learned men at their time did not lift and tote and plow. In their mind, to ascend in society was to distance oneself from real work. When it came to raising food, building houses, hunting game, and dressing their meat, one half of the colonists looked at the other half and wondered who would work and who would watch. It took them a long time for everyone to realize that unless they worked together, none of them would survive. Eventually, they came to give thanks for their opportunity to make their labor together so productive, but it was a complicated learning moment. They all had to learn to work hard, and nobody's enthusiastic about that. They also had to learn to live with their neighbors. That was a frightful challenge for them. Those who peopled the neighborhood were terrifically violent warriors whose notion of warfare and conquest were absolute and who didn't pale at the bloodiest means of fighting. The Pilgrims had to learn the ways of these people and had to learn how to live in harmony with them. More than that, they also had to learn that their neighbors were an amalgam of tribes and languages and customs, each distinct and each certain of their place and territory. The new arrivals were at a disadvantage in every way. Not to mention, they were ill-equipped to understand the cultures and expectations of those whose lands they occupied. We should also mention the Pilgrims were famous for not getting along with their neighbors in England and in the Netherlands. It wasn't all their fault. Their differences in religion and thought contributed to their aloofness, but their very self-definition was to be set apart and to be different. This made their dependence on their Stone Age neighbors something complicated and intricate. And yet they gave thanks for it. Without what they had received, they would never have survived, and they knew it. They did survive, so their thanks was as sincere as it was unexpected. These pilgrim forebears also had to begin to understand themselves somewhat differently as well. This they did in all manners of ways that exceeded the circumstances of their everyday lives. They had to put up houses different than the ones they left behind in England. The food they ate, the crops they harvested were completely different than they were used to. All of the challenge of security and defense were unique to their new situation as they were surrounded by the languages and peoples of Northeast North America. They had to shift their vision of what prosperity and nobility was like as they faced the prospect of survival in the cold, stark woods of New England. More than this, they had to begin thinking differently of God, whom they desired to serve by their coming to the Americas. They had always thought of themselves as embodying the new initiative of God at work in the world. As God's especially chosen people, they were confident that they were going to originate a whole new presence of God in the world for everyone, especially a new presence for those who were mired in the tired cultures of Europe. By striking out for the new world, they could become a new model of how to accept the message of Christ and live by the Word of God. As has been quoted endlessly, they were to become as a city on a hill, shining for the whole world amid the dark wilderness. And the darkness of the wild world wasn't limited to the brooding forests of North America. It also included that they would become a city on a hill to the tired arguments and stultifying politics of the old world. God had chosen them, and they were going to respond. And their survival was one of the proofs of the divine at work among them. Many had died, and most were shocked at the difficulties of their lives in this new place. But many did survive. They attributed this to God's beneficence. God was indeed beginning a new work among them. But they were also the beneficiaries of a new work among them as well. When they first arrived, they were content to cast their neighbors as godless pagans, whom they could ignore if they could not convert. Rather than being implacable enemies and the children of Satan, these people were the ones who knew what these pilgrims didn't know. While the sons and daughters of England didn't soften in their view of this different race, they did humble themselves in the face of the situations that they confronted. Without the help of these indigenous peoples who surrounded them, the pilgrims would never have made the transition to their new home. So when they gathered to give thanks, their gratitude had to extend to the wisdom accumulated by those for whom the forest was not strange and the landscape was not foreign. The work of God became much wider and more intricate than the pilgrims had first imagined. Like true pilgrims to the divine all through history, God's work became something more intricate and more surprising than they ever could have imagined. It turned out God was bigger than their imagination. When they could pause long enough to look around at what had happened to them, they gave thanks for how they had been shepherded into a new kind of life. The source of their gratitude was God's graciousness upon their lives. They knew Despite the deprivations they had experienced, the wealth of this new land was incomparable. Most of what they had suffered was because of their ignorance and their foolishness, rather than the insufficiency of nature or nature's bounty. To be grateful, to find out you were wrong, is its own blessing. The Pilgrims at this first Thanksgiving were indeed blessed. All these lessons are still in place for us today. As we take a look around at the tough parts of our lives, while we make our way through the wilderness of today, it's time for us to take stock and to see where our gratitude might lie. We may have to learn from our environment if we're going to become a city on a hill in our generation. Our wilderness now includes the frightful anti-Semitism burgeoning everywhere, like mushrooms after a spring rain popping up from the sodden wood rotting around us. Protests and outrage against the Jews have become a daily element of our society and around the world. If anything, it provides an insight to us about the Germans of the 1920s, who seemed to give themselves over to hatred and resentment and to make way for the horrors of the 1940s. For decades, everyone has marveled at how the most educated and sophisticated society in Europe could have chosen a government dedicated to the elimination of the Jews. Now, it appears, we know how. Several years ago, a movie reviewer was trying to evaluate the brilliant performance of the actor who played Adolf Hitler in the stunning movie Downfall. The film details the events in the last month of the Third Reich as everyone at the heart of the German government was preparing for the final battle. The acting was superb and the drama was gripping, even though the outcome is inevitable. But the reviewer noted a problem with the movie and named the difficulty the filmmaker faced. The movie's challenge was to make Hitler a character relatable to the viewers, but not a sympathetic one. No one watching could feel sorry for the Führer as he was going through the motions of the last days of his life. He was a monster, so no one should feel his pain. But now we know, as we look out at the mobs in our streets and the horrifying words spread about, making sure we imagine Hitler as someone no one could relate to or feel anything about is to make him uniquely awful. He becomes a monster. But if he is a monster, then his monstrosity doesn't include us or our ideas. The more the character is separate from the rest of us, the more we get the message that who he was and what he did could never be duplicated. We get the notion that he was Frankenstein, created in the laboratory of the unique German politics and the one-time craziness in the aftermath of the First World War. This ogre was put together from the various parts of time past, assembled from the bits and pieces of the previous age, and was all the more awful because he had become a product of cruel nature. That's what we're told and what we're schooled to believe. Now, we look around at the crowds, we hear their chants, and we begin to understand. The monstrosity of the concentration camps did not lie in one man, but within the people. Hitler and the Nazi systems were monstrous, but their horrors lie just below the surface of civility, our civility. They can show themselves at any moment. Now, as we come face to face with the darkness of this so far unexplored territory among us, as we watch the people call out for the extinguishments of Jews as they march in the streets and of the capitals of the world, we have begun to learn a little more about ourselves. Perhaps we need to learn even more. Scratch just a little, and the Nazi hiding in each of us begins to show himself. Yes, the situation of Gaza and Israel is complicated, and all the more so because of the vast intricacies of history. And we all know tit for tat in human affairs is no way to settle the difficulties between peoples. But it was the same in Europe in the 1920s, when politicians made their living calling for the elimination of the Jews. Such ideas could fall to the ground and take root before anybody noticed. Such things were ignored because everybody was looking somewhere else. When people began calling everyone's attention to the words and presumptions being discussed in party meetings and being chanted on the streets, nobody had the time or inclination to pay attention because it was all so complicated. There was the communist threat to Germany, which was real. The horror stories of the Soviet Union were seeping across the border, and they were mostly accurate. The ghastly nature of the regime in power in the eastern stretches of Europe needed no exaggeration in any way to make anybody's blood chill. And it was all true. The Soviet threat was real. The world was also poised on the precipice of economic disaster. The Great Depression had gripped the economies of the world, especially in Germany. And no matter what political promises were made or who might be the leaders of the different parties, they had to fix the economy and make the money sound. People were worried about what happened and who was responsible. Anybody who pointed to any cause or laid out any plan had a hearing. And when these real threats were discussed, they were also woven into all kinds of insinuations and accusations. Crazy talk about the extermination of the Jews and the elimination of the subhuman parts of European society. That kind of talk was common among other solutions and proposals. But the craziness didn't register to most people because they had other concerns. Hatred of the Jews, anxiety at the Soviets, fear of national humiliation, the frustration at political alignments, the collapse of the economy. All of those things combined into a threatening, shadowy wilderness that made everybody afraid. When a party arose claiming their solution to the problems people faced, a party arose and they claimed that their solution to the problems that people faced was the right solutions, and one thing followed another, and then the Shoah happened. Everybody was looking somewhere else. As we look at what took place all those decades ago, we might pause and have a moment of recognition for those people who never noticed until it was too late. They didn't know their inattention would lead to extermination and genocide. All they were doing was wondering what was going to happen as all the shouting was going on. And when it was all over, they defended themselves by claiming they didn't know. And it was true enough. They hadn't intended such things to happen. They hadn't intended directly and immediately. But they did not change what was being said. They did not listen to what they were being told. And they did not count the consequences of what was happening around them. And so it did happen. And it happened while everyone was listening to something else. If we want to survive in this new world that we've seen, we'll have to do some changing. As the society around us becomes more and more non-functioning, we'll have to become more sophisticated and more attuned to our environment. Like it or not, we're going to have to listen to what's being said, and we'll have to pay attention to what we could easily ignore before. If we want our pilgrim society to thrive in the brutal wilderness all around us, we're going to have to change. As we change, we can give thanks, but unless we do, we'll not make it for long. Like our pilgrim ancestors, we seem to have a difficult time thinking about more than one thing at a time. We prefer our choices to be black and white and nothing else. Thinking about our choices and deliberating about our future, we're enamored of simple solutions and stark choices, and we stay away from anything involving complications because we imagine them to be inauthentic. But that kind of thinking is foolish. As former New York City Mayor Ed Koch once said, every complicated problem has a simple and straightforward solution. That's wrong. Complicated situations produce complicated analyses and intricate solutions, and those solutions have to be intricate if they're going to be helpful. If we're to follow the example of our pilgrim progenitors, we have to discover how to survive in a world made new by harsh choices and intricate problems. Rising anti-Semitism is one of our problems. We have others. We're facing the breakdown of the shared understanding of our common life together. Our society is unable to agree on what its life together ought to look like. Rather than a clear understanding of what we want from our communal life and a real commitment to bring this about, we've allowed our common spaces and our common expectations to become colonized by disorder and dissipation. We now find it somehow acceptable that people sleep amid the fence rows of our city lots and pitch their tents under the overpasses of our interstates. They do all this in the face of freezing rain and bad weather, seemingly without any notion of living in a decent life in a common society. There are no simple solutions, so we presume there are no solutions. If we're to make our way through the deep forests of today, we have to learn what to do. The general hopelessness of today results in record drug use and record suicide. The roadways of the past have now become a pathway abandoned by many. What we could always count on as the guarantors of progress have now fizzled. And there are many people who can hardly imagine that progress once existed. We're having a hard time. It's not unlike the first winter in the harsh climate of New England as the Pilgrims strove to hang on. They thought the snow would never melt and the sunshine would never return. But it did, and when they were able to look around at what had challenged them, they set to and began to respond. They changed their view of what was important to themselves and began to understand they were in a new world. What had worked before was not going to function in the same way. They had to change. More than anything else, they had begun to pay attention to their world as it was, not as they imagined it to be or what they wanted it to be. In fact, they had to work out new answers to the new questions facing them because the old answers left them hungry, endangered, and cold. There was no way to the life they wanted until they were willing to find it. And they did find it, and they gave thanks. It had made them. The truth is, it made all of us. American identity rests on our willingness to pursue what is right and to do what others have felt unable to do. And because we know the answers to our needs come from God's beneficence, we know our final response is to give thanks. The wide world we face is not our father's or our grandfather's world, but ours. The gift of our time is ours. It invites us to give thanks for our own blessings because they are ours. We're not huddled among the forests in New England in 1621. We're staring into the sunshine in 2023. But we are invited to stare into the world that we face and find the way to prosper here. It won't be easy, but as we do, we know God will not abandon us as we make our home here. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment. We have a poem today called Do Dreams Die? Do dreams die as the images waft away, the soaring aspirations of generations fade? Oh, at the break of day, as night brightens, we wake, and the nightly run of images and words we forsake. But the moving energies of society alive, do they also disappear when our thoughts reprise? It seems a tough question in our day and time, easily a trap out of which to climb. Are we waking and seeing true daylight, or are falling asleep, surrendering to night? It could be our greatest dreams are but delusions, banished by the clamoring truth's intrusions. If thus it were so, we are to be grateful, to have awakened to the distortions harsh and hateful. But if our dreams toward which we strive and long, empty, they will falter as a fading song, and soon we'll remember only a snippet of melody as memory fades and slips. That's Do Dreams Die? Hope everyone has a chance to enjoy this coming holiday. It is a blessed time for all of us and a great time to focus on what is most important. I hope also that in the weeks to come, you'll have the chance to join with us as we continue to explore what it means to be living Catholic.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.